So I got a couple more animals I'll talk about, and I'll talk about kind of the last piece, bring how some of these all come together in larger works. And now I'd like to mention one of my new current pet projects, I guess you want to call it that. So I mentioned the serpent. The serpent plays an important role in symbolism pretty much every culture, one way or another. Its ability to go under the ground, basically even die, and come back out and be reborn. But also, because of that knowledge of life and death, it is considered to have a lot of power. And sometimes you actually see it eating its own tail, the Ouroboros, because it, again, completes that cycle, life, death, rebirth. We also sometimes see a winged Ouroboros representing that volatility, that kind of sometimes more of a knowledge or kind of that layer above, like we saw with a winged lion or something like that. So the serpent or a dragon, depending on how it's kind of spelled out, will come into play. Sometimes you may hear of a salamander, that deals more with fire and an element of fire or a sub-aspect. So sometimes reptiles, salamanders, dragons, serpents, very similar, but they may play slightly different roles in terms of things. So again, the phoenix, this one again plays a large aspect, that death, consumption, rebirth, the purification. Very important symbol for the alchemist. So it comes in a lot of places, in a lot of ways. This is a little faint to see. There's an I-N-R-I here. Again, you have the consumption or rebirth. And sometimes you'll see an egg nested in here as well. Sometimes it's above a kingdom or on a cliff, that looking down, that kind of aspect above that volatility sometimes coming into play. So some of these are easy. They're very kind of deeply ingrained. You kind of recognize them in their role. I mentioned the pelican earlier in terms of its role of self-sacrifice. So as a symbol, in terms of personal sacrifice or growth, it was a step of the process of our 5 birds. It also represents a piece of glassware. So again, depending on the context, it may mean, we're talking about a self, you're taking a part of the process and you're destroying what you have to make something else or bring something else back out of it. Or it could simply represent a piece of glassware that had these necks. You heat something up, it would go up and it might condense and come back down. So it would literally kind of give of itself, but then come back in and feed itself, so piercing its breast that way. Again, I mentioned someone talking about glass. We're talking about glassware. A lot of modern glassware used in the organic chemistry lab or any chemistry lab is very, very closely related, not very few steps away from what was developed by the alchemists. The materials may be pure, the glass could be pure, but if you look at this right here, you have the hydra, you have the bottom flask, and it goes up and you take off a piece at every step. This is a fractional distillation. That's how your gasoline gets made these days. A little more complex on the industrial scale, but you take the crude, you're heating up, you're breaking it down, and reacting, and pulling off heating oil or diesel or whatever, pulling off these layers here. So the alchemical process of the glassware related to the hydra still plays a vital role today. You have the pelican, you may have a bear, a very large flask, and then a rich wood on top. You could have an ostrich, you could have a turtle. You even have the lovers, the conjunctio, the male and female. One heats up, condenses into the other one, so it kind of goes back and forth, this conjunction or blending together of two things as part of that process. So one is needed for the other, that marrying of the male and the female to get that third aspect, that new product that comes out of things, that tria prima. So a lot of interesting symbolism. I mentioned the salamander, that aspect of fire, again used for consumption. Again, we think of that bird pathway. You can think of the salamander as again one of the animals related in these processes. And my last favorite one, the Sanguinis draconis, dragon's blood. Those that are familiar with resins and incense, dragon's blood is a nice red, solid resin. It makes a nice potent incense ingredient. And basically, if there's a tree, cut the tree, and the resin comes out, and it drips like red tears or red blood onto the ground. They collect all that, and it dries, and you basically brittle, you break it up, you grind up and make incense out of it. Well, people like to have a story instead of, it's a resin out of a tree. dragon's blood was the result of a dragon and an elephant wrestling, the elephant winning and then stomping the dragon into the ground. So the dragon's blood was actually the blood of a dragon stomped into the ground by an elephant. Much better story than saying, oh, there's a tree.
Is there a reason why it's an elephant?
I think it's basically where the resin comes from. So it's like an African continent where it's primarily from. So that was the kind of beast of choice.
Or the elephant may have stomped the tree that produces the resin.
It could have, yeah, it could have, or been rubbing its tusks against it, and then ripping the bark, and then therefore the resin would come out. So it could have been a very similar, kind of approach. But again, if someone calls it dragon's blood, you don't know where it comes from. You're going to create a better story, in terms of that. So I've added a few pieces. There's a bunch of slides. We're not going to spend tons of time just because I don't want to completely overwhelm everybody. Everyone reaches a saturation point. What I want to talk about is, we talked a lot of symbols. We've also talked a lot of symbolism and stories, or you can say that stories relate to a lot of processes. All these kind of are pulled from, or kind of snapshots from larger documents or larger kind of processes. And an important one is called the 12 Philosophical Keys of Basil Valentine. He was a 15th century alchemist. He was actually a canon in the Benedictine prior in Germany. And he got into alchemy, he actually became, joined the monastery, and there, he'd been doing herbalism, and then he started learning about alchemy. And one of the reasons he got heavily involved was actually to help an ailing member of his order who had kidney problems. And had spent years in agony, and then, Basil Valentine started working on the Philosopher's Stone, working on the process. He was able to heal his brother, and so a lot of this comes from that work, his explorations. So again, it really typifies the idea of self-sacrifice. What you're trying to do is not just for your own good, but for the greater good, healing of somebody else. And it also shows you that a lot of the work was done in monasteries, or done by people following a religious path. It was a personal transformation path they were following, not just that idea of I'm looking to make gold, which kind of becomes an overriding theme, unfortunately. The 12 keys are written like 12 stories. And there are many layers in each story. And sometimes it's tough to figure out, is he talking about philosophical aspects, or is it a layering in of a process? And they aren't long documents. I've got a translation that runs about 22 pages, and most of it's preface and then aspects. Each key is less than a page long. But it talks about a story, and a lot of what I've mentioned, the gray wolf of antimony, the green lion, all these things are actually different pieces within these 12 keys. And if you can follow the various keys, you learn about the processes. He says, if you understand this story or this part, you can move on to the next key. And it's very well couched. And he says quite clearly, this is couched so that those who know or understand what I'm talking about can do this process, so that a layperson can just pick up a document and start trying to do things that you had to be pure yourself before you could do this. Because if you brought any impurity into the process, you would get any impurity back out. So it was kind of a process. You had to be ready to yourself before you could understand the story, therefore understand the undertaking. Each step represents a different part of the process. The final goal being either a stone, or which also can be a red oil that you would then ingest for healing. So some of the attributes or the parts that have been given to these, amalgamation, separation. We saw a lot of these symbols or a lot of these processes early on in their relation to either zodiac or kind of larger processes. Some of them still don't, it's kind of tough to say, what is he talking about? Here's a couple that are kind of more open blanks. I'll show you some woodcuts to kind of show you these. And you'll see there's a story embedded in each one that also can be a process. I'm not going to overrun with every key, but here's our gray wolf. And that's actually how the story starts. They talk about taking the young king, and the old king, and he dies and he's thrown to the wolf. He's consumed, and you take the wolf and you pull out the new king. Well, this is an amalgamation. You bring things together, the antimony and the gold. But then they have to pull back out, the pure, the element, the piece that you want from the rest. So you kind of put the pieces together, you amalgamate, you purify, and now you start separating out. And you'll see this can represent, the sophic mercury here, that piece that we're pulling out of that, potentially. Again, these are much more layered stories at times. Purification. there's a part where there is a rooster is consumed by a fox, and the fox is then consumed again by the rooster. Okay, and that barnyard sense doesn't exactly add up, but it could be, there's something is, alchemically or chemically, digested by something. Then you add in more of that, and react, the product with more of the starting material, or something along those lines. Could be something very simple. But again, it also talks about, something meat being consumed by a predator, then gaining strength, and then kind of reversing that pattern. Putrefaction. It seems odd that we have the fourth step is actually death, where we have kind of a death and amalgamation earlier on. But again, now we have a different type of putrefaction, or a greater putrefaction of the soul, potentially. I picked this because I love the German woodcuts. They give a nice personality to these stories. In solution, we have our green lion potentially, but also now with a crown. So royal. It could be either a more important step. It could be involving gold. This here could be our alembic or something else. It could be kind of distillation. We have a bellows. We have fire. So heat can be used in the dissolving process. Again, deeper stories built into these. So again, the male and the female coming together to make that third, that conjunction. We saw that with the glassware as well, that the male-female community. So again, it could be some type of process. But again, spiritually bringing together the male and the female, and then a third aspect that is related to that philosophic aspect. Again, you'll see there's a marriage going on here, but again, there's our whole distillation aspect and multiple retorts and everything. And this one here, this woodcut, people try to figure out, okay, what exactly does it mean? Is it the interconnection from the tria prima, the philosophical salt, four elements, and the chaos, and then the hermetic signal on top? Or is it the kind of gestation? You have the conjunction, then something growing inside of that, coming out of that process. You have something important crystallizing in the center of all the chaos, the water of life here, taking the center. Then fermentation. Again, something that's buried and decays is a fermentation. It's odd that they pick a corpse for fermentation, but again, you're thinking of the philosophic body here, something happening to it. But again, there are other deeper symbols going on. There are archers shooting something here, or it using a bird aspect. So again, the layers put into the story, the symbols buried within. Again, another part of the cycle we have, here are four birds coming into play. We have again our tria prima and our serpents connecting all those pieces together. And then last again, we have the final tria prima. Actually, this one has Latin, and we also have Hebrew kind of mixed in there as well. And lastly, again, we've seen our lines before. Here we have our sun and moon kind of being brought together, the multiplication. That's a little cubs. And then get some last aspects, calcination. Then we have our philosophic piece here, a sun, a moon. Then the lion consuming the serpent, consuming the knowledge, and pulling the pieces out. Then lastly, again, we bring all these together. We have our crowned serpent, our royal serpent, so it's gained knowledge. It's gone from a base serpent, either gains wings or gains a crown, so now it's become royalty, or it's become purified, again, gaining that nobility from the primary serpent in the center. They have an overlay of serpents as well. And for me, how it's all cast in one flask. Where I've gotten a lot of these, again, there are whole books of emblems. There's also a website, there's an alchemy website by Adam McLean, who's in the UK, and he's also gone through and colored a lot of these and picked alternate versions. So he's kind of tried to pick the colors based on the alchemical process and what they represent. Some are the same woodcuts, some are slightly different, but you can see that he picks the green lion, the winged lion, or winged dragon here. He's added colors and rainbows into this. So it's interesting how he's done his best to kind of bring the colors in and show you those pieces of that. So it's an interesting website. If you want a lot of alchemical material, it's a great website. Manuscripts, physical alchemical processes, spiritual alchemical processes, a lot of different languages as well, Chinese alchemy, so interesting stuff. It's neat, it's depictions of all of this. And so we have bring on this last aspect for this one together. We talked about the 12 steps. Well, 12 steps, 12 symbols of the zodiac. My first thought, oh, they relate. Each one of these is a step. Maybe it takes a year, a couple of years, and you revisit. It doesn't match up perfectly, unfortunately. There's only a few of these, about half, that really match up with the zodiac. But the other ones that don't match up are all very important steps. So you can almost consider there are the 12 zodiac processes, and then I like to consider there are 12 kind of secondary important processes. You consider that the 212, most of the ones you pull out all will match in there with these as well. So it's an interesting concept. And I'll mention my last one, because I love this one. This is a nice one. I think you guys will kind of find interesting. See if these are on or not. This up. The last thing, this is one I kind of came upon recently, alchemically in the past few years, is we always talk about multimedia presentations. Alchemy is a great medium in terms of that, because you have the written words, you have the deeper meanings of the symbols. A lot of these come, especially more recent texts that were have the German woodcuts or woodcuts in symbolism. There was an alchemist, Michael Meyer, 1617, put together a book called Atalanta Fusions, and it was a book that had 50 emblems with epigrams and a discourse and a discussion on each one, and he wrote a fugue for each one. And so instead of having the 12 parts of the process that Basil Valentine had, he had basically broke it down into 50 steps. Which again, you can look at these larger ones that do break down. But the nice part is there was all these layers put together. So again, really showing that alchemy brings in a lot of pieces. He also did some Rosicrucian music as well, so he has some nice stuff along those lines. And so, just one example is we start off with the first one with a large figure. You consider, Jupiter or someone like that standing there, the wind blowing, and the wind has carried it in its belly. So the first epigram, we have our first symbol, and then within that, we talk about the Boreas is moved, so one of the gods of the wind, the hidden in the womb, shall one day rise up living to the light, surpass all heroes' deeds, with art with hand and body, strength and mind, in abortion, and grip are born beneath good stars. So maybe a starting of the process. So you can start the process, it's been carried, and now it's time to begin to kind of come forth and start. Get my cursor. Do that. One has to outsmart the computer, which is an adventure. So these are all fugues written for 3 voices. There's Atalanta Fusion, which is Atalanta fleeing. So it's her fleeing, being chased, so her voice, the voice of the chorus behind her, and of who is chasing her. So there's 3 voices. And a scholar has taken all the fugues, and some of them were not complete, and has rewritten them and then recorded all of them. So there's actually a book out of all the fugues, and mostly it has all the music and the story. And then there are other ones that talk about all the the diagrams and the epigrams and all of that. So you have to take the 2 pieces and bring them together. But it's amazing to listen to the music and the way the tones and the voices change as each emblem changes, and it represents the story as well. So it's kind of interesting, alchemical music, and meditation almost, while you're studying this and understanding the story that goes along with that. I was lucky because the original version of the book had a cassette tape, which is impossible to find nowadays, even on eBay or whatever. Being the person I was, I kept digging until I found the actual author. I asked him, hey, I'm working on this. Can I get a copy of the tape or whatever? He was actually nice. Said, oh, we're remastering all of this, we're going to re-release it, but I'll send you an early copy of the CD. The book has not yet been released 4 or 5 years later, but I have all the music so I can understand it and, and really listen to it in quality now and really kind of get the whole message. So it's really kind of that next layer. He's got some beautiful music. There are kind of MIDI files available on the Alchemy website that I mentioned, but not the same ones. I'd be able to try to re-record it, but the person who was a music professor who studied medieval and Renaissance music and history, so he really understood the nature of the music at the time, and really, I think, did a very, very impressive reconstruction of all that. Yeah. So, last couple slides here, we'll wind up. I also belong to a chemistry fraternity, which uses a lot of alchemical history, a lot of alchemical symbolism as part of its structure. And one of the kind of primary figures we use is Paracelsus. So I always like to end by showing some of the work of Paracelsus, also the father of kind of modern medicine. But here you see some of his glassware in the alembics, the retorts, and you see some of the symbolism kind of brought all together in that. He really is the one that brought minerals into the use, mineral salts, the use of medicine, so mercury salts that were used for treating diseases or whatever. Now we recognize a lot of them are more toxic in their own way, but even arsenic salts are being revisited for cancer treatment, for cancer. So some of these things have kind of come, I dare say, full circle alchemically from being useful to being dangerous to now having an applied use again. So they do come back. And I unfortunately kind of gave you a sneak peek of one of my slides here in terms of where the alchemist comes into play in modern culture. Obviously, Harry Potter's a big one. I'm a fan of Silver Age comic books. So I picked 3 kind of big villains that you have appeared. You have Dr. Alchemy, the Alchemist, and Mr. Element, all from the Flash. So
are they all from the Flash?
What's that?
Are they all from the Flash?
Yeah, all 3 of these are from the Flash.
The quintessential Hermetic comic book release.
It can be. Faster in speed. But again, you can also travel time and transmute things. So Firestorm was more alchemical in his way, but its own way. But we could discuss comic book alchemy anytime. So I like to point out, pop culture will not let alchemy go. It likes alchemy a lot. There's a lot of mystery to it, but there's also a lot of spirituality to it. And the more you dig into alchemy, the more you realize you don't know. The more I read, the more like, oh, wait, this symbol here, and so it really is an art where you kind of always are learning it and kind of perfecting it. So, and someone asked if they get a copy of this. I'll get this made up as a PDF so that I can I'll get to Scott so we can distribute it and make it available to you guys. And what someone asked at one point is some good references, and I mentioned a couple of them. One is, down here is the Alchemy website by Adam McLean. He's got an amazing collection. He spends a lot of time translating and putting these pieces together. It's a lot of good work.
You can also actually get Adam's entire collection on a CD.
Right. You actually get some of these drawings on CD, and he has courses on alchemy and translations and everything like that. So he has a lot of material. I pulled a few things from the Journal for the Society for the History of Alchemy and Chemistry, long it's called Ambix. And they just, last week, finally released all the digitized material from 1937 forward. You have to be a subscriber, but for the wealth of material, if you're really into alchemy, there's a lot of material there, a lot of interesting articles. I was pulling stuff from the first issue in 1937, and stuff I was showing today. So it still kind of stood that test. The book that started all for me was The Lure and Romance of Alchemy. It talks about Chinese alchemy, Indian alchemy. It's a very thin book, but it has enough to whet your appetite, either give you some basic information if you're interested, or kind of start you down that path. I drew a lot of nice drawings from the Golden Game, which is alchemical engravings in the 17th century. It's a nice thick book, but I got it on eBay for like $20 or something like that. So not always easy to find, but you can find good copies around. And if you really want to look at symbolism, I love the German woodcuts. They just have a great style to them. And then lastly, kind of looking up, is there are 2 books on chemical art or chemical symbols, featuring chemistry from alchemy and modern molecular science. If you're not a chemist, there's still a lot of amazing stuff in here. If you're interested in the history of science, there's a lot of interesting stuff. There's a couple of drawings of lab notebooks from students that are just amazing in terms of the drawing. They were not particularly accurate, but they were beautiful drawings. They kind of make you think of the old alchemists. So lots of stuff, and I appreciate you guys letting me run a bit longer than probably initially planned. But happy to entertain many questions if you want, or if they want to get up, stretch legs, whatever, talk informally.
We got any questions?
That was wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not a
Thank
question,
you.
but
Thank you very much.
Other than your research on the symbols and things, so do you do any practical alchemy?
I actually tend not to do a lot of the physical alchemy because as a chemist, it's just an odd little thing. So for me, it's more, I tend more towards the kind of philosophical, spiritual alchemy myself. So, you know, I have kind of a lot of personal transformation stuff that goes on along those lines. But I actually have started thinking about setting up and doing some of that myself, doing some physical alchemy. I also do herbalism. I blend incense. So I do kind of that level of alchemical work, I guess, of my own. So that's one reason why I like dragon's blood. It's a great incense ingredient. It's got a great story to it, and it's just kind of got interesting properties. So. Thanks again, guys.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really cool.
Yeah, it was.
It is. Tim, do you want to go in like 10 minutes? Could you be ready to do
10 minutes.
Divine?
You said 15?
15? That's fine.
That's like sort of 10:45.
10:45.